Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be giving a brief introduction to the Old Testament historical books. We begin by looking at the world of the Old Testament. We're going to look at some maps. If we look at the Middle East, notice you've got two major river systems, three major rivers. The Nile River, the Euphrates, and the Tigris are actually running in parallel. And someone noticed back in the 1800s that there is an area of relative fertility. Notice I put the two major river systems, but there's some minor rivers too that connect them. And someone gave the title of this area, called it the Fertile Crescent. That is, it's sort of a crescent shaped a bit, and you've got this area of relative fertility. In the middle of that is desert. So, dry desert broken up by this area where you can do farming. Sometimes you have to fight with the land, but where farms and civilizations grew up. Now, in that area, then you've got Mesopotamia and Egypt. Mesopotamia just means that's a Greek term that means the land between the rivers, and the name stuck. Egypt is what we call that country. They call it something else. I'm not going to get into that. Mitzar, if you're speaking Arabic today. But we'll use the English terms for each of these, Egypt and Mesopotamia. And the reason I'm not using a country name, because Mesopotamia is more of an area, is because you're going to have a number of different country groups in there in the ancient world. It doesn't really correspond too much to the political divisions that we have today. So I'm not really going to use those. That means that between Mesopotamia and Egypt, there's something of what we can describe as a land bridge. That is, if you're going from Mesopotamia over to Egypt, you're not going to go in a straight line. You're going to follow the waterway. You're going to follow this land bridge. And it makes that connecting area, and that's going to be the area where Canaan and Israel will eventually be. It makes that very strategic. Also, if you're coming from the north, what we call modern day Turkey, ancient Anatolia, the land of, in Old Testament times, the land of the Hittites, they would use this as well. And so this becomes a key area in the ancient world. Israel then is going to be located here. And as we open with the book of Joshua, the Israelites have moved into this area, but they're sharing it with other people groups. And that's going to be the case for a bit. Now, Egypt, as the land of the pyramids are already old by the time the historical books open. They were already ancient history, even to the Egyptians. In Mesopotamia, you're going to have the Assyrians in the northern part of Mesopotamia. They're along the Tigris River, and we'll see them appear when we get to the books of First and Second Kings. They were already there, but they weren't interacting with folks in Canaan. So they're going to be sort of out of sight, out of mind in the first half of the historical books. We will also see Babylon. Now, Babel had been mentioned as early as Genesis chapter 11. You say, what's the difference between Babel and Babylon? I always ask this as a test question. It's actually two different ways of pronouncing the same place. In Hebrew, it's the same place. But Babylon was already an ancient city, but it's not going to be a primary city until toward the end of Second Kings. So it will be there, but we're not going to see a lot about it. And a couple of other places. Notice you have Aram there in the middle of the map. Aram is what we call Syria today, but that's a later designation. So Aram, and perhaps you'll hear the language of Aramaic being referred to. It's going to be a language that's a lot like Israel. In fact, they'll share the common alphabet. You'll have the Phoenicians. We're going to see them when we get to the reign of David and Solomon. These are the Canaanite neighbors to the north of Israel. The Phoenicians, in particular, are going to be focused upon the sea, and we talk about something called phonics, that is the sounding out of letters in order to learn how to read and write. The Phoenicians are going to give us their alphabet, but actually, we know today that the Phoenicians had got it from either Semitic peoples or down in Egypt, started really early in those locations. But because they're a seagoing people, they're going to take that all throughout the Mediterranean, and good for them. The Israelites will not be a seagoing people, but we'll see that later on. Later on, when we get to toward the end of the historical books, we're going to see the Medes and the Persians. Again, they were there already, but we're not going to hear from them until much later in our story. So let's focus now on Israel, and we're going to zoom in on this section of the map. Here we go. We can call it Israel. We're going to call it initially the land of Canaan because, as our story opens, Israel was a people, but they were people without a land. And we're going to start in the book of Joshua how they get the land. Now, if we do a cross section of Israel, and so this is as if we were able to take the map and turn it on its side and look at it from the side. Notice you've got the sea, and then a very gently coming up with this coastal plain. Do you notice there's no natural harbors in that coastal plain? There's a little peninsula where the mountains jut out all the way into the ocean, but for the most part, it's straight and smooth and not very mountainous. It's flat, an area of coastal plain, except for again that little peninsula that juts out. As you move inland, you first pass what are called the foothills. The term for that is the Shephelah. But then quickly you can see, even from the coast, you can stand there and see the mountains in the distance. And so you have this central mountain range that runs north and south up and down the land of Canaan. Now, these aren't really high mountains, like Jerusalem is about 2,500 feet above sea level. Um, Depending on where in Jerusalem you take the measurement. Um, so that's not incredibly high. That's not like, mountain climbing sort of thing, but they are high and it makes that area cooler. And then as you continue to the east, notice there's two big lakes in the north. You can see a little lake, Lake Hula. It's dried up nowadays, and then the Sea of Galilee, and then the long Jordan River flowing to the south all the way down to the Dead Sea. And this area is known as the Jordan Rift Valley, named after the River Jordan. And it's the lowest spot on the face of the earth. That entire river is below sea level. So the Sea of Galilee is about 500 feet below sea level. And then the Jordan River goes down, 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 all the way down to the Dead Sea, which back in biblical times was about 1,200 feet below sea level. Today it's even lower. The Dead Sea is getting smaller and it's drying up about 1,400 feet below sea level today. If we look picture, and this isn't a recent picture, this is dating back, maybe 40 or 50 years ago, the compliments of National Geographic. This is the Jordan River as it looked then. Today, it's not that lush and fertile. It has become for many years a no man's land between the countries of Israel and Jordan. You still have a lot of, at least last time I was there was a lot of barbed wire that was there, and not a lot of farming going on. But you could see how the Jordan River would wind its way southward, very lush, very fertile, because this river would overflow its banks every year, flood the area, and then leave this layer of topsoil, which made it great for farming. As you continue to the south, notice how at the bottom of the picture you can see the Dead Sea. The river straightens out right at the end and then flows right into the Dead Sea, again, the lowest spot on the face of the earth. If we continue to the east, the land area rises, and now we're in the Transjordanian highlands, and so that Jordan Rift Valley separates the land between. We're going to call it the land of the west of the Jordan, Canaan. The land of the east is going to be other folks, not necessarily Canaanites, that will be there. Now, the climate of Canaan is a Mediterranean climate. When they say that, what they mean by that, it's not too hot, although it can get pretty hot. I was in Galilee one time, 110 degrees Fahrenheit. But they were setting records for that. And it doesn't get too bitterly cold, although it can snow up in the mountains. Now, they are very dependent upon their winter rains. So sometimes you'll see a reference to early and later rains. And if you're not aware of that, it makes it sound like, well, it rains and then it stops, and then it rains and then it stops. Actually, it's not quite like that. The early rains begin in October. It rains a little bit, and a bit more in November, a bit more in December. January is the height of the rainy season. The rainy season is in the winter. and then it begins to diminish February, March. By April, you have the later rains. It's not raining much, and by May, it's dry, and everything is dry in the summer and wet in the winter. And so they depend heavily upon their rains. If it doesn't rain, oh goodness, crops are going to die, and so they need those winter rains. Now let's look at a chronological survey of the period of the historical books. This is from 1400 BC. All the dates are before Christ, BC, or if you want to say common era, before the common era or before the biblical era, however you want to describe that. But from 1400 BC all the way down to 400 BC, so about 1,000 years of history. We begin, of course, with the story of Joshua and his lifetime. So around 1400 BC, our story is going to begin. By the way, I'm assuming that First Kings chapter 6 and verse 1 that tells us it was 480 years before the building of the temple that the Exodus had taken place, and that they had left Egypt. So I'm assuming that reading, that's what we call the Masoretic text. I'm assuming that verse is to be taken literally, and that's how I'm building this chronology. Not everybody agrees with me, and I'm not going to argue the point. I'm just assuming that. So next we have the period of the book of Judges, a very long period, a few hundred years, from somewhere in the 1300s all the way down to just before 1000 BC. That's the period of the Judges. The book of Ruth takes place during that. Ruth chapter 1 verse 1 starts off in the days in which the judges judged. That's the Hebrew text. Next, we have the period of 1st and 2nd Samuel. Now, notice 1st and 2nd Samuel is so long they had to divide the book into two parts, and yet the time element involved is much less in the book of Judges, which is considerably shorter. So it's almost as though the clock slows down as we're looking at three lives in 1st and 2nd Samuel, Samuel himself, and then Saul and David, the first two kings of Israel. And then after that, we have the period of 1st and 2nd Kings. Notice the clock speeds up again. We've got the stories of 19 kings of the northern kingdom of Israel, and also 19 kings of the southern kingdom of Judah. Judah is going to last longer, so their kings reign longer. And this story comes to an end in 586 BC when the temple is destroyed and the people are taken away into what we call the Babylonian captivity. Now, I go from 1st and 2nd Kings in our English Bible to 1st and 2nd Chronicles. Notice I'm not including the genealogies in this because the genealogy in First Chronicles chapter 1 takes us all the way back to Adam and Eve, and so that would make just everything in the Old Testament, and in the later genealogies it actually extends beyond this point to probably sometime in the 300s BC, which tells me when it's written. But excluding the genealogies, the historical portion of this, I'm not saying the genealogies aren't historical, but I am saying that the historical narrative part starts with the death of Saul, and then includes David and Solomon, and all the way up to not just the Babylonian captivity, but beyond that to the return from captivity in around 539, 538 BC, where the Jews are given permission to return. And so the last two verses of Second Chronicles are identical with the opening verses of Ezra. They actually, there's a little bit of repetition there. And the book of Ezra talks about how they do come back and they build the temple, and that's in the first half of the book of Ezra. And then the later half of the book of Ezra, notice, takes place about 50 or 60 years later, where Ezra himself brings back more people and sets some things in order. Next, you have the story of Nehemiah. Notice instead of putting a whole segment, I just put a line because it's fairly brief. Where Nehemiah he leads more people back and they rebuild the walls, and he puts again some things in order that remain. And then I also have the book of Esther, which takes place earlier than Nehemiah, earlier than the last part of Ezra, somewhere in there, where the story of Esther takes place. But so those books are in sort of chronological order, but really more topical order because Ezra and Nehemiah are sort of a unit, at least in the Jewish mind. Speaking of the Jewish mind, let's go now to our English Old Testament. You have the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, Genesis through Deuteronomy. The section that we're studying here, the historical books, start with Joshua, and we've looked at them chronologically, but Joshua all the way down to Esther. Next, in our Old Testament, we have what we call the books of poetry, Job through Song of Solomon, and finally the prophets, the prophetical books, from Isaiah all the way down to Malachi. Now, that's in our English Old Testament. That's the arrangement of the books. If I go to a Hebrew Bible, Hebrew scriptures will be arranged differently. It's the same books, but they are arranged differently. So Torah and Pentateuch are really the same thing, same books, just a different title. But in the Hebrew Bible, I go from the Torah now to the prophets. The way you say that in Hebrew is the Navi'im. The im is plural. We're going to see that when we look at Hebrew. But the prophets, a Navi is a prophet, and they include Joshua, Judges, notice they skip over Ruth, Samuel, Kings, and then Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12. What they will do is they'll refer to Joshua through Kings as the former prophets, and they will refer to Isaiah and everyone who comes after as the later prophets, but they see these as prophets. And then they'll refer to what we call the minor prophets. They'll just call them the 12. They're in their own little collection, but they're all under the prophets. And then the rest of the writings, and that's the term they're going to use, the writings, the ketuvim, just means the writings. Um, Notice Psalms, Proverbs, what we call the poetical books, but also books that are read at particular times in the religious year, like Ruth and Lamentations and Ecclesiastes and Esther. And then they'll put Daniel and Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles as part of the writings in a separate category. And that's an interesting arrangement. And it tells me how they view these books. You see, when we look at the historical books, and I'm going to use Joshua as an example since it's sort of our crossover, Joshua is going to tell us Joshua's story, and it's going to tell us about the conquest of the land, and it will then give us a division of the land. And that's a real quick way of looking at the book of Joshua. I'm going to give you a much more detailed outline in a bit. But when I look at Joshua as a prophetic book, I might focus on some different things. Prophetically, it's not Joshua's story that is front and center, although that's there. It forms the background, but it's Joshua's message. And Joshua, the book of Joshua, both Joshua himself and the book of Joshua are telling us something about the God of the Israelites and about what his people are called to do and what they are called to be. I also have this emphasis of Joshua as a covenant witness. Actually, this is going to be an important part of the book where Joshua is going to take them to a place in Israel where there are 2 mountains, and half the people are going to stand on one mountain and half are going to stand on the other mountain, and they're going to ratify and remind each other and call each other to account of the covenant. And half of them are going to pronounce the blessings, and the other half will pronounce the cursings. And so there's a lot about covenant in this book. And there's a call to covenant faithfulness that is emphasized in this book. So it's the same book, whether I see it as a historical book or a prophetic book, but I want to focus on both of these. But also, I want to note that we can look at it not just as a historical book and not just as a prophetic book, but also as a Christological book. That Joshua brings them into the land where they can have a rest, but they don't get the rest. There's a rest that remains, and I'm borrowing this from Hebrews chapters 3 and 4, that talk about how Joshua brought him into the land, but they didn't enter into that final rest because the final rest remains. There's someone else. There's another Yeshua who is coming that would give us a greater place. Can I call it even a greater land? And the reason I say it that way is because the land becomes the entire world. He says to his disciples, "Go out and make disciples, not just in the land, but of all the nations." And so we have a greater story. We'll look at that more in a later class.